Hello. Hello, hello. I hope everybody's having really great conversations over these delicious lunches about what we all can go out and do with data after today. But I'm up here to introduce our keynote speaker today. And so I am Rachel Dissell, and I work for the Plain Dealer. And I'm also on the Data Days Planning Committee. Thank you. That's super nice. Usually people just shout and say mean things. And I really wanted to say thank you to April and Taylor for making journalism part of the keynote today. Often we're just the people who are begging for the data, and maybe we don't even always say thank you, so thank you. But I think this is a vital conversation that we have in our community, especially at this time. A lot of people have been asking me about the Plain Dealer lately, and it's often in that is the cancer terminal tone. You know, do you think it'll survive? How long do you think it's got? And sometimes I shrug, other times I curse. Or if I feel like laughing or making everybody else laugh with our legendary journalism gallows humor, I tell the story about my friend Tom Farron, who after being laid off from his job of nearly 37 years earlier this month, came back to the newsroom to write a story about our latest round of layoffs. If you're interested in hearing more about that, The New Yorker did a great piece on it, and there are Monty Python references. That day, I was sitting with Plain Dealer Guild Unit Chair Ginger Christ in her living room. We were in our pajamas, and we were fielding calls from distraught colleagues when Tom called us. Ginger thought he was kind of following our protocol that we set up to notify us that he had gotten the call, that he was no longer an employee. We'd expected to hear from him because he had volunteered to lay off, because he wanted to be laid off because he wanted to save another reporter's job. Nope, that's not why he was calling us. He needed a quote for the story that he was writing. Why am I sharing this? Not because I think that journalists deserve any special sympathy. Good people lose their jobs all the time. Industries change, and in Cleveland, we are well aware of the devastation that can cause, and it's happened in many industries. But it did get me thinking about where data and journalism collide. If we were to look strictly at the data, we'd see that from 2001 to 2016, more than half of print media jobs dissolved. Digital media hiring has not made up for that decline, and the jobs that have been created are less stable. More than 2,400 media jobs in the US have been eliminated so far this year, and that will include more than 35 jobs from the newsroom that I work in at the Plain Dealer. Together, those folks had more than 930 years of institutional knowledge to nail the perfect headline, to make sure that the first draft of history had as few typos as possible, and to tell very important stories in this community. Here's another takeaway, though. No matter the circumstance, journalists keep doing their job. They always have. On battlefields, when their own colleagues are gunned down at their desks, and on nights when their lifelong friends are laid off. We post our stories, and we put a damn paper out. That sort of gumption is what gives me some hope. It means that we'll keep finding ways to do this job, and it's one that I wholeheartely believe is central to our democracy, whether it's pretty and whether it's not pretty sometimes. I think that we will be able to find new tools, and tools that are being created right now, to get our formerly ink-stained hands fully footed in the digital world. Data, without a doubt, is one of the most powerful of those tools. Whether gathered by the US Census Bureau or a website scraper that someone created at home on the weekend, data can help journalists do many things: spot trends, hold public officials accountable, and even save lives. It can also help us measure whether policies or solutions to those problems are working. So it doesn't always have to be a negative thing. It can help us determine when we're headed in the right direction. You'll hear today during our keynote address from one of the folks at the forefront of making data accessible and useful for journalists. Troy Thibodeaux heads a team at the Associated Press that's on a mission to gather and distribute data to local journalists to make it useful and to create impact. That means the Associated Press can do the heavy lifting to gather large sets of data and strike agreements to get data that we don't have already on topics like refugee resettlement patterns, charter school enrollment, or life expectancy. And then they can send that data to places like Cleveland for us to report on locally. Last year, the Associated Press got an exclusive data set that was used in a Detroit news story about a proposed U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development rent hike. It would have raised rents for poor and elderly residents in public housing by an average of 21% in that city. Then, a Detroit news reporter was able to go out and find a mother of 4 who worked as a home health aide, whose rent could have gone up by 50%, and also a 90-year-old woman whose rent could have gone up by more than $70 a month, and this woman was living on Social Security. HUD Secretary Ben Carson quickly backtracked on the plan, and he cited the reporting, maybe slightly annoyed by it, when he did so. Troy's going to talk more about the importance of those collaborations and how they can be done. But seeing as today's theme is data for action, a lot of people have been asking, what can I do? And a lot of people have asked me, like, what can I do to help? What can I do to support the plain dealer? I think to support journalism here, one of the first things you can do is pay for it. I know it's hard. I know we're all on limited budgets, but a subscription to the newspaper, or eventually Cleveland.com, the website, when they put a paywall up, is one thing that you can do because reporting costs money. And thank you to those who already do so. Another way is to take the shared interest that we have here in this room in transparency, accountability, civic engagement, and problem solving, and consider more ways that we can partner together to bring the data that we have to the people. Collaborations between those who gather and analyze data and those who can knit it together into stories that touch people personally and touch their hearts and make them want to change things are what we need to do more of here in Cleveland. Thank you, guys.
Good afternoon. Thanks for sharing your lunch with me. As Rachel mentioned, I lead the data journalism team at the Associated Press. So what does that mean? This is my team. I am deeply proud of my team. I have the great privilege to work every day with some of the smartest people I've ever met. These are the nerds in the newsroom. These are the folks who do quantitative data analysis, who build software, all with the aim of doing better journalism. Before we had a team, we started the team about 5 years ago. And before we had a team, I wasn't the data team lead, I was just the data guy, right? I was the nerd in the corner. People didn't really know kind of what to make of me, so they'd say, well, what's his title again? It's just, he's a data geek. So how many people here are the data geek? Let me see my data geeks, where are my people? All right. What about the folks who are just data curious? You dabble a little bit in data, right? And then there are probably a bunch of folks in between. You've gotten your start, you're getting your sea legs, but you're not all the way there yet, right? So I can identify with all 3 of those groups because before I was the data nerd, I was a nerd of a completely different stripe. I was a lit nerd. I was doing a PhD in English literature. And someone came up to me at a party and said, hey, you write? And I said, yeah, I write. And they said, well, we're about to fire our, our technical writer. You want a job? And despite the many lucrative possibilities for a life writing about poetry, I decided to take the job. So I spent a lot of time as a programmer, and I learned about databases, and I learned about data analysis. And then I found an opportunity to come back into the newsroom and bring those 2 halves of my world together, right? And the way that I brought them together, and the way that I think about it, is that data is a source for stories. And this is how I make sense of it. This is how I brought the 2 halves of my life together, and this is the way we make sense of everything that we do. A reporter is only as good as his or her sources, right? Who do you know? Who's going to take your phone call, and what can they tell you? And data is a source for us like that. What can it tell us? And we have to also approach data the way we approach human sources. What are they telling us? Why was this data collected? What's the background here? What's missing? What does it know and what does it not know? And it might have been collected for a reason that makes it inappropriate for this analysis, right? So we think about interviewing the data the same way we think about interviewing people. Because stories begin life as questions. And the better questions you have, the better stories you can write. Data both helps us define and ask better questions, and it helps us answer those questions. And we have the great honor of working with beat reporters across AP, across the world, who are deep subject area experts. They know sports, they know business, they know immigration, they know the environment, and they bring the best questions. And then we have to find a way to translate those questions into stories, right? Into a query that can then become a story. But we can do that with a surprisingly few set of tools. And for those of you who are kind of data novices, if you're taking your first Excel class, you'll notice when you go into Excel, there's this funky looking like backwards Z, right? The sigma. And if you pull that down, there's the auto sum. And you'll see in there they've got a few functions: sum, average, count, min, max. And with those few tools and a few others, we form the basis of our data journalism, right? Because this is what we want to ask. We always want to ask about the big and the small, finding the outliers, right? We always want to ask, so we have a saying in data journalism: an outlier is either a mistake or it's the story. Sometimes it's a mistake. Sometimes we have to go back and ask, is this real? No. But sometimes it's the story. Why is this thing not like the others, right? And then how do we step back from the trees and see the forest? What are the aggregates we can use? What are the ways that we can show, we can describe this set as a whole? And that combines, summary kind of functions, aggregate functions, but also modeling. And the folks on my team teach me something every week, some complex math, some really interesting, algorithm they can use. But often it comes down to this: how do we summarize this data in a way? How do we tell the story of the data overall? How do we provide the context against which we can measure those outliers, right? And then grouping or clustering. You can also do that. It's called a pivot table in Excel, right? You can start to see how things shake out in terms of the buckets. And we think about buckets when we're telling stories. How are we going to create the buckets for our data? And what's going to be, how do we know what's important? How do we compare those buckets, right? And then correlations. Now this gets really fancy. And there's some folks on my team who can do some seriously fancy stuff with correlations. But in essence, it's just about relationships. If one thing goes up, does the other thing go up? If median income goes up, what happens to life expectancy? It goes up as well, likely, right? So we're looking at some very kind of basic concepts that we can translate into more and more complex sorts of algorithms and models, but in the end, they're all, oops, something just happened. They're all showing the foundation of a story. And then finally, change over time. This is the one formula that every journalist knows how to do. They all figured this one out because this is becoming important, right? You want to see what's happened over time. And if you think about these basic formulas, they are kind of the essence of storytelling. So you've got your outliers, the big and the small, right? So that's your contrast. But in order to understand a contrast or a conflict, every story has to have a conflict, right? In order to understand the contrast or the conflict, you have to have the baseline. You have to have the aggregate, the summary, the description. So you've got your scene setting with your summary. You've got your conflict or contrast, and then you've got the change over time. Every hero has an arc. It's either the hero's journey or it's the decline and fall, right? But there's an arc to a story. And so knowing change over time tells us that. So these very basic concepts in terms of statistics are really the fundamentals of everything we do in terms of data journalism storytelling. So here's an example, starting with a question. Who are the victims of gun violence in the United States? This is a story we wanted to tell. And there's no good data on this. This data doesn't exist, right? The best data set we could find was a data set from a nonprofit, the Gun Violence Archive. And they have 12 researchers spread around the country, and they're just capturing media mentions of gun violence of every kind. So we knew it was incomplete, right? We knew the data set wasn't comprehensive, but it was the best available. And the good thing about this data was that it was granular. These researchers had recorded ages. They had recorded places. They had recorded relationships between the people in the incident. And so we had good granular data, even though it wasn't perfect. And with the better data, we could tell better stories, stories we couldn't tell otherwise. So we were able to tell that during the first 6 months of that year, children were killed in gun accidents at a rate of 1 every other day. This is something we didn't know. We thought maybe we were going to tell a story about mass killings or about gang violence. But this was the story that leapt out at us. Because we had better data, we could tell better stories. And then even better data, more granular. There was a spike among 3-year-olds. There were 2 spikes. It was bimodal, right? But under 5, there was a spike at 3. Why would there be a spike in gun accidents involving 3-year-olds? What do you think? They don't think it's a risk yet. They're still too young, right? Oh, they wouldn't do it. They're old enough to pick up the gun and operate it. They're not old enough to understand the danger. And so there's where the storytelling comes in, right? The stats weren't enough. The data wasn't enough. It was about trying to find the why. And that's where the story becomes engaging. What we measure matters. It matters in 2 ways. So data both reflects our attention. If we're capturing something, if we're capturing data, it's because we think it's important. It's what we measure, right? So we measure what we think is important, but also it directs our attention. It both reflects and directs our attention. Data says, look over here, look at this. So I have an Apple Watch. I have these rings on my watch. I don't know what they mean. It tells me to stand up every once in a while. I stand up. It tells me that, I got to breathe. I breathe. But, otherwise, I don't make meaning of it. It's just random data coming at me, right? But I have a colleague who has a Fitbit, and she's obsessed with her Fitbit. If she doesn't get her steps in, I'll see her at the coffee maker. She's getting her steps in. She's warming up her lunch in the microwave. She's getting her steps in. And it works. It's meaningful to her, right? It's not just data. There's meaning to it. And what has meaning to us and what we've measured is what can change. Because now we know. Now we have a baseline, right? I also have an app that tells me how well I sleep. And this is more just kind of random noise to me. I look at it once in a while and say, oh, here's your sleep quality. Okay. And then one day I looked at, there was this anomaly in my sleep chart, a straight line. And I thought, well, that's weird. What is that? And I said, oh yeah, June 2013. That's when the twins were born. And I said, but it's not just that my sleep quality has gone down, it's this weird straight line. And then I realized, oh, I stopped setting my alarm because I was waking up every 2 hours anyway. I didn't need an alarm. So what this is showing is a period in my life when I wasn't capturing the data, right? But because it became meaningful to me, it became part of my story, now I start to look at it. Now I understand it in that context. So data makes stories credible. Better data makes for better stories. But stories make data meaningful. Stories are how we make sense of our lives. It's how we make sense of ourselves. How we go from a random set of impressions to a life story. Who am I? I am my stories. And so it's the same with data. How we make meaning of it is the stories we tell of it. Why is it important? Something that we always want to remember. Data is people. The data that we're looking at as journalists almost always reflects the lives of people. And this is one of my favorite graphics ever. Because when I look at this graphic, I can never forget for a second that these are people being represented. This is from the University of Connecticut, and they asked people to get out on the football field and line up by their height. So from 4'10" to 6'5", line up where you are in front and back of the sign. Women dress in white, men dress in blue. What's the distribution look like? Amazing, because I look at this as a journalist and I say, I want to know her story, and I want to know her story and his story, because they have literally different perspectives on things. And I can remember every time I look at this, that every time I look at a data set, what I want to know is, how does it affect people? Who are the people reflected in this data? And something else to keep in mind. Sometimes the story is what's not shown, what's not measured. 80 years before that picture was taken at the same university, they did the same exercise. What's the difference here? No women. There are no white shirts out here. What's not being measured? You're going to do a histogram of human height, and you're not going to include any women? What's missing? So we have that experience. Sometimes for us, what's missing becomes the story. So we were going to do a story on hate crimes. What's the prevalence of hate crimes? How has it changed over the years, right? And we're looking at the FBI data, and we found that in 2,700 jurisdictions, 2,700 sheriff's departments and police departments, they reported 0 hate crimes. They've reported 0 hate crimes for a year, at least 1 year. And we thought either there's something really interesting to learn from these communities in that they've eradicated hate crimes altogether, or they're not reporting hate crimes, right? It's either the story or it's a mistake, and it turned out it was a mistake. We found media reports, there were hate crimes happening here, they were not being classified as hate crimes. So what's missing can often be part of the story as well. So why should we care? This is the thing, as a journalist, the question you never, ever, ever want to hear from your editor. So what? Who cares? Why are you telling me this? And as researchers, this is the question that's got to keep you up at night, right? Why do we care? I had an environmental reporter come to me and say, we've got to do something about salt water. It's a huge problem. Salt water is very important. And I thought, it's water. Water's okay. It's salt. Salt's not a problem. Why do I care? He said, well, look, it's happening. It's in all these states that produce oil and gas from fracking, they have these spills of salt water. And it's in every, look at all these states, and here's the volume. And I thought, okay, but why do I care, right? And he said, well, look, it's more than 180 million gallons over a 5-year period. And I asked the question that is the heart, what Edward Tufte, kind of the godfather of data visualization, says, is the question at the heart of all analysis. Compared to what? Is 180 million gallons of water, salt water, big? Is it small? Compared to what? We don't know. So then he told me, in 7 of the 11 gas and oil producing states, brine spilled was more than twice the amount of oil spilled. Okay, now I've got to compare to what? And we all know that oil spills can be a problem. And then he lowered the boom and said, and we don't know how to clean it up. We don't know what to do when we spill oil. We figured out kind of how to clean up an oil spill. But with a saltwater spill, we don't really know what to do with it. So I thought, all right, maybe we have something here. And then we found these guys. And I knew we had a story. And this is what John Flesher, that environmental reporter, wrote. Carl Johnson and son Justin are 3rd and 4th generation ranchers who for decades have battled oilfield companies that left a patchwork of barren earth where the men grazed cattle in the high plains of New Mexico. Blunt and profane, they stroll across a 1.5-acre patch of sandy soil, lifeless, save for a scattering of stunted weeds. And I thought, now that's a story. Now I care, right? Because it's people. Because there are ranchers here who can't ranch anymore. They've lost their livelihood. They've lost their heritage. Now we care. Or take, for example, the story that we did on life expectancy. This could also be kind of bland, right? If you come down to it. I mean, it's life expectancy, it's stats. It's the kind of stats you see all the time. And so as Rachel was mentioning, we took life expectancy data that we had from USA Leap, and we distributed it to our members. And so we started looking at the differences in a very granular way, at the census tract level. So it's the small area life expectancy project. This is where we got the data from. So we found these stats. Census tracts in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, have a median life expectancy of 76.25 years. That's around average, right? This is a good baseline. This is a good summary. This is a good set of context against which we can talk about contrasts. And then we said, okay, the shortest lifespan in a census tract here is 65.4 years, the longest 88.6. So that's a pretty big gulf, right? You got some serious variability there. That could be interesting, right? And then we visualized it. And now you can start to see the patchwork. And visualization is a powerful tool because it retains the capacity for surprise. If I'm crunching numbers in R or in SQL, I kind of know what I'm putting in. I kind of get a sense of what I'm going to put out. I visualize and suddenly things leap out at you. It affects a part of your brain that gives you a spontaneous pop, right? So we can start to see the patchwork of Cleveland and what it looks like in Cuyahoga County. And that was good. And then Julie Washington, the plain dealer, picked up that story, picked up our data, and wrote this at the top of it. On the east side of Cleveland, there are a few blocks surrounding a water plant where a little over 1,200 people live. It's just across the street from the Cleveland Clinic. A Clevelander living in that part of the Fairfax neighborhood is likely to die before they turn 66, about 20 years sooner than someone residing in Southerly Park, less than 5 miles away. And now we care, right? Now it's not just stats. Now we see the people. So, what makes a data story successful, right? Context. Context is king. Compared to what? Conflict or contrast. Every story has to have a conflict. When I was working in DC, I was covering the Obama inauguration. And I was told that my editor, it was the first time I got to go out in the field, get out from behind my computer and go and cover something. I was so psyched. And then they said, you're going to have a block of the route for the inauguration parade. And you're going to go there and cover it and send it, call in color. It's like, fantastic. So I go out there and they say, look for conflict. Look for conflict. I was like, So I go out, and it's a love fest. Everyone's all these people who came all this way to see Obama's inauguration, they're kind of happy that Obama's getting inaugurated, right? So there was no conflict. I'm looking around, and then I found the folks from the Westboro Baptist Church. They understand conflict. They understand how to create conflict, and they understand their messaging is on brand, as it were. If you don't know about them, they say some rather inflammatory things, right? So I went and I covered them. And I said, there's the conflict. Okay, I can call that in. And I saw them debating with a man. He had his 2 young children there. And they were debating with him about the meaning of the Bible in the context of civil rights. And I thought, okay, there's my conflict. I'm going to call that in. And then I held off a second. And I went one step deeper, and I tracked that guy down. And as I walked up to talk to him, I heard him telling his children, after he had just this sort of heated debate with the Westboro Baptist Church folks, he told his children, you see, that's what freedom of speech is about. That's what's great about our country. And I thought, okay, now I've got something else. Now I've got characters. Now I not only have my context, what the scene is here, I've got my conflict, but I've also got characters, people we can care about, right? And that's what makes it a story. And finally, change. I spoke earlier about change over time, the hero's journey, or the fall, the decline and fall, right? Change is something we always want to try to tell stories about. But also change is about the potential for change that Rachel was talking about. And this is where the local journalism is essential. Identifying potential for change. Finding problems that folks maybe didn't even recognize were problems. And this is actually the story that with the HUD data that we did. And it was amazing, to see folks take this story and say not only, okay, there's going to be this big proposal coming out of Washington. And the story everyone told was, okay, the lowest income people are going to see their rents triple, right? But, as Rachel was saying, we checked the formula. And what the formula said was not just they were going to raise the base rate, but they were going to eliminate deductions for dependents and medical care. So now, not only did it affect a larger swath of the population, but it also disproportionately affected people with children and illness. And if you take that policy in that context, right, understand it in terms of the lives, the people that she was talking about, and the lives like Thaisa Timms and her children that are going to change, now we can affect policy change as well. If we understand it in those terms and not in the cold terms that the stats might give us. And here's one last example. This is an example we did with Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting in California. And they spearheaded this investigation into redlining, unfair mortgage lending practices, right? And it was not an easy data set to work with. It took us 6-8 months to land this project. It was hard. But this data was available. It was available because of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, right, HMDA. Because of that act, we had access to this data, and we could tell this story. That in these places across the country, the color of your skin indicates whether or not you're going to get a mortgage more than your income does. And this was fairly sobering. We're able to identify, and then we gave this data out to our members. In all of these places, they were able to tell the story of unfair lending practices on their turf, what it meant to their people, and go out in the streets and talk to them about what it meant, and find examples of people who had been denied mortgages and make it real. And because of this reporting, and because of what Reveal did, and because of what our local members did, we had hearings in 5 states. It was mentioned in Congress. City councils across the country were talking about this. Something that folks could have even denied before was a problem, right? There are people who would say, assume, well, racism's still a problem, therefore redlining still must be real. And people who would assume, I haven't heard anything about it, can't be a problem. We were able to illustrate, because of the power of the data we had and the storytelling behind it, that this was a problem that could be addressed, and change is happening. There's actual change happening because of this reporting. So now I want to reach out back to my data nerd friends, my people. If you are the custodian of data, if you're the caretaker of data, these are some of my best human sources, are the people responsible for the care and feeding of data sets, because they understand the importance of the data they deal with. They live and breathe it. They know every single column in that table. They know every foreign key. They know the history of the table, and they know that this column is null for the years 1989 through 1994, because that's when Bob retired, and he was the one tracking that data. right? These are the people who can fill us in, who can tell us how to responsibly use that data. You've got to want your data story told. Sometimes public information officers don't know enough to tell us yes. They don't know how to tell us yes responsibly. So we need to work together with the folks who take care of the data so that we can let it sing, so we can tell its story. Thanks very much. If you have questions, is there a microphone running around? Happy to answer any questions.
Hello, this one's working. Any questions? Or where are the questions? It's the better question.
What are your top? Hello. Oh, there it is. What are your top hints for getting nerds and non-nerds to work together well to get the stories told?
Yeah, this was something that it bedeviled me in the beginning, right? Because I had these technical skills, but the other folks in the newsroom weren't including me in their conversations, right? And so I started talking to folks about getting me in earlier, letting me be part of the reporting process. And what we started doing once we built the team out was we started embedding our reporters in with the global beat teams. So there's a global beat team for immigration, environment, race and ethnicity, education. And so now our folks are there in the meetings from the very beginning. And we especially framed it as, don't worry if it's not about data. Don't worry if it's not a data story. We want to hear what you're interested in. And people always love telling you about their work, right? So we just sat in the meetings and started listening. And what we started trying to do was translate, start to take their questions, because all stories begin in questions. How do I translate that question into a query? And then what we found was something incredibly powerful, right? That they asked better questions than we could have of the data. We turned those into queries, and we were able to refine their questions. Then they go back out in the field. They go back to their human sources, and they ask the better questions. And then they come back to us. And so it becomes this virtuous circle, right, of conversation, of dialogue. And that's where it really started. We got away from the computers, right? We got away from the algorithms and sat down and talked about what they were interested in, what the questions were. And then we showed them. And we started using our markdown files. So it was basically like, here's a graphic that shows you something. Here's a paragraph, or 1 or 2 sentence paragraph, speaking your language, right? Inverted pyramid. Our data editor started working with all of the quants on our team, saying inverted pyramid, right? Start broad, narrow down, like basic journalism tactics, because we wanted to speak their language. So answering their questions, speaking their language, being part of their world, and then showing them the power of what we can do. And it's every single beat. As soon as we have those kinds of dialogues going, they start coming to us. And now it's a great problem to have, but suddenly we're overwhelmed with folks wanting to come to us and ask how we can use data on their beat.
Other questions? I got you.
I had 2 questions about the gun violence story or data. One is, did you look at correlating the increase with 3-year-olds with the increase in gun ownership, particularly among women? And what was the other spike? Was it in the teenage years?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, we don't have great data across all states on gun ownership. We don't actually have that. So that's one of the places, and there's so many stories that we want to tell. If we had better data, we could tell them. And then the other spike in the bimodal, it was in high school years. And the difference was 3-year-olds tended to shoot themselves. 15 to 16-year-olds were shot by a friend. They start playing with guns, they start showing them off. And then you have that other spike. Yeah.
You talked a lot about the data that you don't have, and being that the press can't get politically involved, knowing what you don't have and knowing that probably the public sector and the nonprofit sector could provide you with that data, how do you bridge that gap to actually advocate for the data that you're missing?
Yeah. You mentioned the nonprofit sector, and that has been a really interesting inroads for us. So that HUD data that we had, in order to determine the effect of that change in the formula, on a city, we had to have individual level data and know whether they had dependents and know whether they had medical deductions. There's no way anyone's giving us that data, right? There's no way and I don't want, like there's the individually identifiable data. I don't want that. Someone accidentally sends me social security numbers, that goes back. I don't want that. But they could take that data, and under their research agreement with HUD, they could anonymize it in a way, aggregating it up to the city level, doing the analysis for us. Actually, we screen shared with them, and so we knew exactly their methodology, but got them to perform the analysis under guidelines from HUD that they were allowed to deliver it to us. And one of the reasons that we convinced them to do that was because of our data sharing program. Because we could say you're not only going to get the AP story that's going to get picked up everywhere, but you're going to get local stories across the country talking about this data, talking about your analysis, and making it a conversation in households around the country. And that, I think, is a really important, so we're looking for more opportunities like that. How do we work with nonprofits to use data that we can't get, and sometimes for good reason, we can't get access to the data in its raw form. But how can we work with nonprofits who do have research agreements to get the data and work with it responsibly?
I was brought up with the knowing that the press was the fourth estate, and I'm a little concerned about the state of the industry because of that. Yeah. I think some of the data you've shown, whether it's the redlining or the gun control, just shows how critical it can be. But given the state of the industry, is there a role that we, either as citizens or as community organizations, can play with regard to the data to help bolster that fourth estate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, I'm really excited about civic tech. I'm excited about ways that, especially in the technology sector, we can show the usefulness of this data. And I think showing its usefulness, in civic entrepreneurship, right, is going to help open it up, show a reason to open it up. So I think that there is that kind of engagement. I think there's also the kind of engagement that, so there's an article that everyone should go out and read. It's by Josh Benton. It's on the Poynter site, Poynter. And he's talking about the effect that local news coverage has on democracy. And he cites lots of studies that show it raises voter participation. The number of mayoral candidates you have is related to your local news coverage, or lack thereof, right? Engagement by, civic engagement, whether folks are going to talk at town meetings. There are all of these metrics by which people are more engaged if they have strong local news organizations. So to some extent, supporting the local news organization, with your dollars is a viable way to work for a healthy democracy. It's demonstrable. And engaging in that conversation as well.
Any other questions? I see one up front. If you have a question, feel free to just raise your arm and we'll come over.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit maybe to the cautionary tale of data, in that sometimes data can be used to tell the story that we want it to tell, and in that it either re-emphasizes a bias that we might already have, it further stigmatizes people or populations, et cetera. And I think you did a great job of outlining kind of what the components are for a good story, but can you just speak a little bit to the consideration of data and the integrity of it so that it's telling a fair story?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to, when I would teach data journalism classes, I would start off with a slide from the Matrix, just a picture of the Matrix, these green numbers running down. And I would say, does that look like a story to you? And they would start a conversation. And then I would show a clip from the Matrix. And it's a clip where the guy who turns out to be the bad guy, I hope it wasn't a spoiler for anyone here who hasn't seen the Matrix, right? Cypher is sitting there and he's looking, and it's just streaming down green numbers on a black screen. And Neo, Keanu Reeves' character, walks up and says, "Do you always look at it encrypted?" And he said, "Yeah, I don't even see the code anymore. All I see is blonde, brunette, redhead." And I said, okay, so that's an example of he can see the story through the data. And also is an example of him seeing the story he wants to see. Right? This is what he's decided in advance is what he's going to want to see. So, there are statistical techniques to can be concerned about. Overfitting. And the folks on my team who are much better at stats than I am are deeply concerned about overfitting, right? And how many times you can try different variables in a data set. So there are statistical ways to kind of control for that. But there are also, I think, common sense ways. So it goes back to that core question, compared to what, right? If you're looking at a histogram that doesn't include any women, a histogram of heights that doesn't include any women, you need to be able to recognize what's not there. And compared to what often means compared to the population, compared to the larger population. How does my sample, and what sample have I chosen here, how does it compare to the population, right? And so we see this a lot with some of the fancier techniques of machine learning, right? When your training data is tainted, when your training data is biased, it can bias your entire analysis, right? So these are conversations that we need to have, and we have to be ever vigilant because accuracy is utmost, accuracy and context.
So you mentioned the term data curious. I think everybody is data curious, everybody's story curious. Sort of a rising tide lifts all boats. How do we get more people to recognize their data curiosity or their story curiosity?
I think the data curiosity, so there's another video that I used to show. There's a guy named Hans Rosling. Everyone know who Hans Rosling is? So he's a health researcher, and he just died last year, I believe, the year before. He did a video series for the BBC called The Joy of Stats, right? And there is a video of him in there doing a live data visualization and talking through it. And it's sort of, he's got health and wealth as his two axes. He's looking at countries over time, and he's narrating this like it's a sportscast, right? And he's so excited, but he's just thrilled. And you can see, oh, and there's World War II, and then, oh, here's the AIDS crisis, boom, and the crash in health. And he's so animated and engaged, and he's a master storyteller. And so I think in terms of getting people engaged, the way that we tell those stories, both visually and with our words, are ways that we can reach beyond stats, right? So I think, honestly, something like, I remember the first time, two of the people on my team who have the strongest quantitative backgrounds, both told me that when they fell in love with stats was when they were traveling with their parents and they got the newspaper in the hotel and it was USA Today and they saw graphs for the first time. It was simple and digestible and they could see it, they could feel it. It was visceral, right? And it changed their lives. So I do think that those communication skills, that being able to tell the story and being able to tell it in a way that is immediate and is relevant to your life is the way that you get people engaged and excited about it.
Hey. So a little bit more in the weeds here. There's a lot of folks in the room that work for nonprofits or for governments that have data. And you've done a lot of kind of collaborations. And I'm wondering if you can kind of run us through some of the things you've learned for best practices for having collaborations between folks that don't normally work together, want to work together so that they don't implode or turn into a bad experience, and how the worker bees that want to do that can kind of map that out for the folks up top that make those decisions.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Especially in our industry, collaboration, that's the byword now. We're all stretched thin. We've got to collaborate more. We've got to figure out how to work together. And sometimes you're talking about competitors working together. How do you build that trust? How do you create that collaboration? And so we've had both very successful collaborations. Last year, two of our biggest stories were collaborations. The redlining story was a collaboration with Reveal. And then we also did a project with CPE, the Center for Investigative Reporting out of Puerto Rico, and Quartz. And we were counting the dead from Hurricane Maria, right? So we got CPE sued to get the death certificates. And then we created the tech around it to be able to count these people. And we had, combined among the three organizations, we called and we listened and we tried to track as many of these people as we could. And that was it's a major project for us. And then Quartz did this stunning. Yo-Yo used to work with AP. And now she's at Quartz. She did an amazing, beautiful job that just respected the lives of the people. Really showed that this data was people. So all three of those organizations had to work together. And then in Reveal, we had to work together. And then when our distributions have to happen, we've got to work with all these other organizations. How do we do it? We've also had some that didn't pan out so well in years past. I'm not going to talk about those right now. But we've learned from our failures, right? One of the things is decide as much as possible up front, right? Who's going to do what? Who's going to control what? How is credit going to be given? And we've got a little template now for a memo of understanding, right? Among all the participants, who is going to play what role? Stay in your lane, define your lanes. Quartz is going to be the visualization, the digital experts. They're better at that than we are. They are. We're going to do some of the hardcore back-end stats, and we're going to build some tools. That's our strength, right? And CPI is on the ground, and they know the place and they know the people unlike anyone else. They're going to be responsible for getting the data and for doing a lot of the interviews. And we also had people, we've got a lot of reach, so we brought some people to it. So we spelled all that out in the document up front. We also spelled out how we were going to publish, when we were going to publish. I talked to the folks from ICIJ. So they're the folks who did the Panama Papers. Massive 200-member organization project, right? And one of the things that they said was decide on the timing up front and make everyone agree that no one jumps the gun, right? No one's going to get out in front of the story. And so take all that off the table up front. Who edits the story? Who's writing the story? Who's doing digital? Where's it going to live? What will be shared and what won't be shared up front? And then after that's decided, and sometimes it's not an easy discussion up front, but now it's over. Now we can focus on the work. And as soon as you get that out of the way and get credit out of the way and get competition out of the way, we can focus on brass tacks, focus on the journalism. And now that's where we've had a lot of success.
How is that different than talking about like a nonprofit or even a private company to do data? How's that discussion?
Yeah, interesting. When we've worked with nonprofits, one of the things that's been really huge for us is to let our guard down a lot. Bring them into our process. Talk to them about how we're going to use their data. Build that trust by talking about it. And screen sharing, doing things, treating them like a colleague in many ways. And so by bringing them into that conversation, one of the things that we do with our data distribution program is we hold webinars where we explain to all of the members how to use the data, where it came from, what our methodology is, how not to use the data, what are the caveats, what are the things to be afraid of. If we're working with a nonprofit, we bring their expert onto that webinar. And often on the record, so our members can get there and get a quote from the expert. And so they know they're going to have the ability to not influence what we tell, but influence how we use the data and make sure that we're using it responsibly. And I think that builds trust. That close working relationship builds a lot of trust.
We've got time for one more question. One more. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to April. Can we have another round of applause for Troy? Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.